we've got a whiteboard for you, and this is something which, I just dropped my pointer, but I have another one over here. This is a graph which I've seen a lot on social media since Donald Trump got elected, and this is not a perfect, it's basically the same. People have talked about this little graph a lot.
This is the two-dimensional political compass, which has been around long before any discussion of Donald Trump, and the only difference between that and what he's looking at here is that he switched the X and Y parts of it.
Like I said, for the past few years, I would say maybe since like Donald Trump got elected, maybe a little bit after, to sort of describe what's happening in American politics. And like I said, it's not exactly what you might have seen, but it's pretty close to it. We've got two axes here to describe political ideology, political movements. We've got an economic axis, and we've got a cultural and identity axis. This is different, by the way, from a political compass.
Yeah, because it's exactly the same, except you switched X and Y. And the reason you did that is because you want to stress the importance of associating right with the so-called social values portion of the right, rather than making it about economics.
A political compass, I believe the x-axis is economic, and the vertical axis is like, I don't actually know what it is on the political compass. It's like size of government, I think.
It would be the cultural and identity portion that's expressed in people's attitudes on the so-called social issues. In other words, exactly what you're presenting here as the x-axis is what the y-axis on the other one is.
Or something like that. But anyway, this is different than that.
It's literally the same thing.
So we've got the cultural identity axis. This is things like, you talk about social issues like abortion, or you talk about gun rights or immigration. Pretty self-explanatory.
Except it's really not, because any control of the government in regard to these social issues also has an economic impact, which was one thing Ron Paul had famously pointed out, that there's really no such thing as separating liberty on the social versus economic side of it. If you limit one, you limit the other, which is one reason that I actually discourage people from using the two-dimensional political compass at all. It's really not useful to pretend that this distinction is clear-cut.
The vertical axis is economic. We've got the cultural right, the cultural left. The economic, sort of counterintuitive because it's vertical, but the economic right.
It is counterintuitive. Maybe you should just use the normal two-dimensional political compass.
The economic left. Obviously, economic right is free market, liberalization, laissez-faire, that kind of thing. Economic left is socialism, government control, and so on. And so I've charted out basically some of the ideologies that define these quadrants, and also where different parties and people would land on this chart. So I would say that in the top left axis, we'll go clockwise, I guess, we've got neoliberalism. So an ideology that is left-wing culturally and in terms of identity, but right-wing in economics describes neoliberalism. I would say the Turning Point USA is pretty representative of that.
Traditionally, this was where you would put libertarianism, but what you'll notice is that his standard for right-wing in terms of economics includes basically business Democrats, right? So we're only talking about things that in the wider scheme of things are all left-wing. These are all leftist groups. None of these groups actually favor a decrease in government, but he's going to define it in this way so that our standard for right-wing economically is so low. It's such a low standard that we can limit the discussion and limit this political spectrum, this political map here, to just like a very, very small difference between these groups. What's also interesting is you'll notice he puts Trump and the conservatives over on the other end of this spectrum, and he's basically just defined it in terms of attitudes about demographics and immigration. But if anything, you'd put Trump maybe between those two things, because it seems like Turning Point USA is pretty much totally in favor of the very, very soft impediment that Trump has presented regarding demographic changes and immigration. Most people are actually quite disappointed with him on this front, besides the TPUSA people. And I think even some people within that crowd would prefer that Trump do more to control immigration. So the way this is being presented, I think, seems extremely disingenuous and just like a really, really weird sort of a presentation. But let's see where he goes with it.
This is an ideology that says, for example, that we can globalize the population. In other words, we can have mass demographic change, mass cultural changes to our country, and that's okay. This is where we hear Ben Shapiro say, I don't give a damn about the browning of America. This is where people say that, well, as long as people come here and assimilate, or maybe in some cases, even if they don't, diversity is enriching our nation, it's making us strong. So long as we maintain a free market, so long as these changes are good for the economy, they're good for us.
This is another way you can tell his perspective is just incredibly socialist. Anybody who refers to the American economic system as capitalist is somebody who is repeating essentially just Marxist dogma. We do not have laissez-faire. We do not have a free market in America. This is the first thing anybody should understand about economics.
That describes neoliberalism. That is, I think, best defined by Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, for example, who says that we can have basically unlimited legal immigration. We can staple green cards to diplomas. We can have a left-wing culture. We can trend left-wing in culture and in terms of national identity, so long as we maintain a free market, so long as we maintain low taxes, low regulations. You get the picture.
What you're going to find is that his entire argument and his entire perspective relies upon the idea of the free market being something that we already have in America, and that what mainstream conventional conservatives, or I guess to him it would be neoliberals, to me it doesn't make that big of a difference. To me they're both very similar in regards to what matters, which is that they accept our very, very heavily socialist system as the status quo, and they misidentify it as capitalism, and they therefore don't see any of the opportunities that libertarians of any variety, even the more, well, I suppose not the so-called left libertarians, but they're not libertarians. Any of the either minarchist or obviously anarcho-capitalist libertarians can point out to you. It's really, it can't be overstated how much the U.S. government damages the country. And to try to list all of the ways and to fully understand that problem is something that you could do forever. To completely ignore all of those ways that things could be improved, all of the ways that we could be promoting the free market, and to say that, ignorance of all of that is equivalent to actually having somebody who might get rid of a lot of these regulations, including things that just go completely taken for granted, like ending the minimum wage, or ending requirements for licenses or for prescriptions. All of these sorts of things, ending all these subsidies that ultimately just increase costs, getting rid of the government's monetary policy, all of these things that he doesn't question at all, that he takes for granted and, worse yet, equates with capitalism, are things that would cause such a greater solution to all of the problems he's complaining about. Now, he's correct to criticize Turning Point USA, because what they consider to be the free market, yeah, sure, that's absolutely not going to solve any of these problems. So I don't reject the criticism entirely, but this framing of it is quite silly. It's a very silly framework.
In this quadrant, we have conservatism. It's economically right, it is culturally, and in terms of identity, right-wing. And I'm using this somewhat loosely. Obviously, we know that the Conservative Party hasn't really been very right-wing in terms of culture and identity.
It hasn't been very right-wing economically either. The government has been increasing in size and has been more and more invasive in economic issues for about a solid century now. It seems that whenever we slow the rate at which it continues to grow, then we consider this to somehow be right-wing, when in the larger scheme of things, we have, the largest government in the world that continues to grow, and any group that is going to either maintain that size or have it grow at a slower rate, there's no reason that you would call that anything but economically extreme left.
They're very much nominally right-wing in terms of culture and identity. In other words, they say they are in name only. So traditionally, Republicans will talk about defending Christian values and defending the American way of life and that kind of thing. On a very nominal level, you could have the GOP in this quadrant as the conservatives, the mainstream conservatives. I think Trump is probably the best fit, though, because here's a politician who is obviously hardcore right-wing on economics.
A politician who said we should repeal and replace Obamacare, who engages in protectionism, who's done nothing to deregulate anything in the economy, has not shrunk the size of government, has not drained the swamp, and has increased the U.S.'s national debt even more than Obama has. This is Fuentes' standard for extreme right-wing economically. This is just insane. This is an absolutely insane standard.
And I'm using these terms sort of in their vernacular. I think a real right-wing economics isn't necessarily hyper-capitalist, but that's the vernacular. I think that's sort of the connotation it has today, that right-wing is towards free market, left-wing is towards big government. So these terms are all a little bit subjective.
Well, they're not totally subjective if you accept the objective standard that supporting free market capitalism would put you on the right end of a spectrum, and supporting big government puts you on the left end of a spectrum. So yeah, if you throw away any objective measure, then it is totally subjective.
Trump is obviously very much a free market guy, the tax cuts, the deregulation, greenlighting the oil projects and so on.
So when you cut taxes without reducing spending, and keep over 95% of all the regulations in place, vehemently oppose any kind of free trade. I guess as long as there's like more oil, that's capitalism. That's pro-free market.
He's a little bit more economically left than his predecessors like Reagan and Bush and others, because he has tariffs and wants an infrastructure project and so on. But
Bush and Reagan were also leftists.
In practice, almost all of it's been very much indistinguishable from Turning Point USA. But unlike Turning Point USA, at least in the rhetoric, Trump has been, in terms of culture and identity, right-wing.
You mean only in terms of the rhetoric. And that's if you've ignored everything Trump has said about Israel, which I know you haven't. I know you haven't ignored any of that, except for right now, apparently.
Make America great again, America first, Muslim ban, people are drinking drugs, crime and rape is shithole countries. All this kind of stuff is, at the very least, implicitly, if not explicitly, culturally right-wing.
So this is what it takes to move all the way across his cultural values spectrum, from Turning Point USA all the way to his standard of Trump. You have to be implicitly and rhetorically pro-right-wing culturally.
And it's worth reminding people, or it's worth acknowledging, that Trump is in a different quadrant from Turning Point USA. These two ideologies are obviously vastly different in terms of their electoral viability. A neoliberal platform doesn't work. Mitt Romney ran as a neoliberal, and he lost. Marco Rubio ran as a neoliberal, and he lost. Jeb Bush ran as a neoliberal, and he lost. Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA initially didn't support Trump because they are left-wing on culture and, ostensibly right-wing, nominally right-wing on economics.
Did you catch that? Now they're not just straight up real hardcore right-wing on economics. No, now they're nominally right-wing. Isn't that funny? Isn't it funny how that little detail didn't make it into the first half of this little presentation? I think he didn't mean to say that. I think that he just knows that it's bullshit and it accidentally slipped out. He has admitted, yeah, he understands they're not actually right-wing. They're not actually pro-free market, but he's just pretending that they're not. I think that's very strange and very suspicious. So apparently we agree. Apparently we agree that this entire stupid graph is bullshit. Interesting.
Trump, in practice, is both of these things, right-wing on economics and right-wing on culture.
Before you said it was rhetorical. Before you said that was the standard that certainly he met. But now it's in practice. I wonder why you didn't defend that standard earlier when you were giving examples.
And this is how he won the election. He went from Marco Rubio, Turning Point USA, mainstream conservative, neoliberal identity or ideology, And he shifted us rightward on culture, I think, and that was the defining thing that made Trump different, that distinguished him, by saying we're going to ban Muslims and we're going to make America great again and so on. And he said we're going to be a party that's right-wing in both ways. On this I'll save this quadrant for last. We'll kind of go out of order here. The bottom left quadrant, we all know it's progressivism. Left wing on culture and identity, you know what that means. Left wing on economics, they're socialist. You've got progressive, you've got Democrats. This is Bernie Sanders, this is Elizabeth Warren. These are people that are in favor of, transgender abortions, and people that are in favor of mass immigration, and think we should all learn Spanish. And they also believe that, the tax rate should be 90% if you earn more than $1 million, and they want a wealth tax and so on. So this one's not really tough to explain.
And I don't really take issue with his characterization of progressivism this way, except that what he's listed here are all of these very, very extreme fringe issues, which certainly do come out of that quadrant. The problem, however, is that there's a failure to acknowledge what these other quadrants have in common with it, and I believe that the real solution is to challenge that at its core, which is to say that anti-racism has become the moral and ethical heart of all of American culture and really Western culture, and that we need to challenge that premise much more stridently. So the problem with characterizing progressivism this way is that then anything that's basically 80% of the way there, such as Turning Point USA, such as that which he calls conservatism, and such as that which he will call populism, he's exaggerated the difference too much. And I think that that's the real issue here. This little chart he's drawn here, it's extremely focused to the point where we're missing the big picture. And I think that the only real way away from these problems is to really expand what it is we could be looking at in terms of solutions.
This is the quadrant that, in my opinion, will define the next century, which is populism. You've got an ideology that is right-wing on culture and identity. You could say it's nationalistic, but it is, in some sense, left-wing on economics. Maybe it's not outright socialist, maybe it's not outright communist or big government, but certainly it is trending leftward on economics compared to full-on neoliberalism or traditional Republican free market Reaganite bullshit.
He basically wants to replicate everything Turning Point USA is doing, except instead of pandering in terms of demographics and in terms of identity politics, he'd rather see Republicans endorse a strategy of pandering based on Gibbs.
You've got somebody like Tucker Carlson on this side. Somebody that says it is important that we maintain the character of the nation. And maybe they're not even left-wing economically, but they're just right along the x-axis. Maybe they're a little bit right-wing or a little bit left-wing. But fundamentally, this sort of economic axis that is up and down doesn't really even matter, so long as we are all the way on this side on culture and identity.
Tucker Carlson thinks that the government should ban self-driving trucks in order to protect jobs. That's how left-wing on economics he is. It's insane.
So somebody that says, well, maybe we support private property.
Except you don't, because you believe in taxation.
Which is an economically right-wing belief. Maybe we support deregulation.
Like in the porn industry?
And something like that, localism. But, we also support people getting taken care of.
Why don't you just donate voluntarily to charities of your choice? Isn't that part of your religion? Isn't that something that should be like an immediately obvious solution to you if you actually believed what you said you believe and take that seriously?
We also support, maybe there's a baseline level of catastrophic health insurance.
Why are we assuming that the market can provide all the other kinds of health insurance, but not this one? This is very strange.
Maybe there's a big infrastructure project.
So rather than companies just building things, we want to have the government steal money through taxation and then use that to pay someone to do the work that the government's not doing anyway, when we could just let Domino's fix the roads.
Maybe there's some kind of stimulus.
If you understand that there's a stimulus coming in as like a person who provides a service or owns a business, you're just going to take that money in the short run. You're not going to use that money to invest back in your business because you understand that it doesn't reflect a real change in the market.
Maybe we protect the economy. We stall technology, protect workers.
Holy shit. I thought that I was straw manning when I mentioned Tucker Carlson being against self-driving trucks. I think that Nick Fuentes unironically thinks that's a good idea.
This is where we have the most room to grow, is by moving from, maybe up here. I think the movement that needs to happen is from neoliberal, left-wing on identity and right-wing on economics. Maybe in the last 5 years, we moved this way. I still think we're probably over here on identity. But the big move was rightward on the x-axis over the last 5 years, going from left-wing on culture, right-wing on economics, to right-wing on economics and right-wing on culture.
But this isn't really true. Basically, the Republicans did all of the same spending that the Democrats would do, except maybe a little bit less, and they cut some taxes, but did so without reducing spending. And the fact that he can describe people like Mitt Romney as neoliberal and that it's fairly accurate shows you that the differences between Democrats and Republicans largely aren't very important and haven't been important for many, many years, arguably decades. So what we have to sit back and wonder here is, what do these movements actually mean? Apparently, implicit statements, nominal positions, rhetorical stances, apparently these are enough to define movement from one of these quadrants to another. What is it really that moving further to the left is going to mean for Republicans in his head? Like, so it means ban self-driving trucks, and what else? Like we're still gonna have universal health care, right? We're still going to have like a mandate for insurance, apparently, but it's just going to be only for catastrophic things, but it's still in there. He says deregulate. I'm not really sure what he wouldn't regulate if he thinks that the government has a role banning porn and banning drugs. Presumably, you could make an argument for just about anything. So let's continue and see if he gives us some really, really good examples of how the Republicans could move further to the left than they already are.
The next move, where we have the most to gain, is a move downward on the vertical axis towards economic populism, left-wing economics in some sense. Even if it's not outright left-wing economics, it's trending in that direction.
How is it not outright left economics? Because we get to keep our toothbrush? Is that it?
And to me, we can control this entire half of the graph here. We can control the entire half of this, what would you call this, a graph, an axis. We can have everything to the right of this axis can be ours electorally and politically if we play our cards right. Now, what does that mean? It means that we can probably expand the electorate by appealing to liberal, white, working class, in some cases older people or college graduates in states like Minnesota or in New Hampshire or in Wisconsin or Michigan, by saying that, we're not in favor of a healthcare plan that leaves people uninsured or slapped with huge bills in hospitals and with ambulances and so on. Maybe we're going to take care of people more. Maybe we're going to have a more liberal approach to economics.
So basically, you're going to offer everything that the left does, except with the added advantage of the fact that they can just label you a Holocaust denier.
You can expand your electorate. We've got this on lock. Okay, we've got all the people that are free market, all the Reagan coalition people here. We've got them on lock.
A majority of the votes are voting against the other party. So if you make yourself virtually identical to the other party, you're going to be losing more votes than you gain.
We can bring this whole quadrant into the fold, of which there are many people in here, by simply losing some of the hardcore Reagan dogma, by just drifting a little bit down on this axis, by drifting a little bit left. I know it's counterintuitive because I'm showing down but saying left.
Yeah, it's almost as though you made it that way because otherwise you're going to be showing your viewers that what you're advocating for is moving to the left.
If we drift a little bit in this direction and maybe get in a happy medium somewhere in this area, that would yield huge electoral victories, huge electoral prospects and potential. And also, this is an ideology which would save the country.
This is what the Republicans already do. It's what they've already been doing for decades, and it's exactly what's destroying the country.
This kind of stuff, everything up here, not really sufficient. Neoliberalism is going to make the problem worse. Everything on this side, this is our enemy. These are the people we have a problem with. People that want to destroy America is what's on the left. People that are left-wing on culture and identity say that basically white people shouldn't exist. And white people's time is over in America, and Christianity is over, and so on. That is this axis. We can have all the rest. And truth be told, I don't really care about the vertical axis. And we can afford not to care, because you know what's going to happen is, regardless of what we feel about economics, this is going to be the defining axis of our time, culture and identity.
Except all of your white Christian communities embrace progressivism and embrace all of the things that you don't like about the cultural left. And they do it because government economic leftism immediately leads to family breakdowns.
In other words, we can have a free market system, a socialist system. We kind of already have a socialist system in some capacity, right?
Yeah, we kind of do. It's almost as though everything you're talking about has already been done.
What is it, like 50% of all healthcare spending is by the government? You look at all the onerous regulations and all the spending the government does. $4 trillion in government spending a year. The GDP is $20 trillion. So that's a fifth of our spending is from the government. So I'm saying in some capacity, this axis is irrelevant. This is what will define the future and consequentially the outcome on this axis.
I'm not sure we can take that as a granted, that people don't respond to free market arguments. But certainly I can understand why people would think that it's very hopeless. The problem, though, is that when you have big government intervention in the economy, this is fundamentally what's destroying these communities. We've seen these problems even before any sort of demographic shift. The demographic shifts are just accelerating the problems because the Democrats are using it to buy votes to support what apparently Nick Fuentes is just endorsing here anyway. So this really just seems like a really long and complicated way of avoiding the problem that Christians haven't kept their pimp hand strong, that they can't stand up to women, that they can't challenge gynocentrism and its role in promoting the welfare state, and that he's completely ignored the fact that welfare and government intervention in the market is what is causing communities to fall apart and be destroyed. I guess he'd rather just see all of these exact same problems play out, but with only white people, right? It's going to be all the same bullshit you see on World Star videos, except it's just going to be all white people. And apparently that's preferred. Apparently that's better. All the same bullshit, all the same degeneracy, all the same nonsense, except, well, at least everyone's white when the fucking collapse happens.
And I've said this before in different terms, but if we go left on culture and identity, if we have mass immigration, whether you're justifying it because you're a progressive and you hate white people, you're a neoliberal and you're Jewish and you hate white people and you want the economy to grow, no matter what side of this axis you're on, if you're on the left, you are going to see America become a multiracial country. Whites are going to become a minority. The Democrats become a party that are never going to leave the White House, never going to leave the Senate ever again. And so consequentially, you're going to get the country in this zone. If you're on this side, you will end up in this zone eventually. Neoliberals are advocating for a policy that will put these people in power forever. I think that's the best way to say it.
They are, because they're not advocating for anything different from what the Republicans are already doing. And frankly, neither are you. It really does seem to me that you're just controlled opposition.
And so that is why we have to be predominantly fixated on winning everything on this side, everything that is culturally right-wing. And we can be in favor of property rights. Like I said, we can be in favor of low taxes and localism and
favoring low taxes is the opposite of defending property rights.
Things like that, maybe a relatively free market, but also we should not be afraid of going left on economics. We should not be afraid of restraining the free market.
And this is how you know that this isn't just like a political strategy to win votes, right? Like, he's clearly not a free market advocate in any sense. It's not like he would prefer free market, anarcho-capitalism. No, he thinks the market is something to be restrained. He buys into basic Marxist dogma about myths such as market failure and things like that. And the way he's speaking about it is that he does see some virtue in a coercive, terroristic monopoly coming in to determine how things work in the marketplace.
Of shutting down big banks, going after the rich, going after, even if you don't think it's a good idea, because truth be told, I'm pretty right-wing on economics, but some things are so out of control, and not only are some things out of control in terms of the economy, but moreover, even if we do things that don't make sense economically now, it's much more preferable to get in power and have left-wing economic policies as nationalists than it is for left-wing people to get in power, no matter what their view is on the economy. Do you understand that?
Yes, this is easy to understand. The problem is that the whole reason behind opposing this sort of leftist cultural immigration is that we don't want socialism. And what you're telling us is we need to just accept the socialism. And you somehow think that it's going to be more palatable than leftist socialism. Here's the problem. People who are dumb enough to think that socialism is a good idea are people who don't buy into any arguments regarding demographics either, because they engage in the thought-terminating cliche known as anti-racism. So this whole maneuver to try to sidestep the real issue, which is the moral and ethical hegemony of anti-racism, you don't want to challenge that because that's too hairy, that's too difficult, even though that's exactly the position you're in. Your existence here on YouTube, your existence speaking out, just being like you're literally one step away from being completely unpersoned. And the only thing preventing that is that some people are willing to challenge anti-racism, except for you. You are not willing to challenge it. And you would rather have us sidestep the thing that actually matters in order to engage in this sophist, disingenuous bullshit of accepting communism in America.
So in other words, even if you don't like this idea, even if you're, I'm a rootin' tootin' Ronald Reagan, rugged individuals, free market conservative.
If you think Ronald Reagan was a good president, then you're not pro-free market.
You might have to bite the bullet. You might have to suck it up and say, well, I'll vote for somebody left-wing on economics, because if these people get in power, it's game over for everybody. If these people get in power, anybody on this side, even if they're up here, this is where you all end up, and this is hell. This is 1,000 years of darkness over here. This is extinction for our people. This is America goes under. America becomes Brazil. And this is what happens if somebody from this side of the axis, or some party or some coalition, controls the government at some time in the next 4 or 5 decades.
They already do, frankly. This 1,000 years of darkness has already begun. The Republican Party is now and has been a communist party for decades.
So to me, and to tie it into the British elections, the quote that I heard from one of these British journalists, he said, the lesson that we learned from Boris Johnson winning this historic victory is that it's much easier for conservatives to go left on economics than it is for liberals to go right on identity. And we should understand that.
British people are communists. Their state has fallen many, many years ago to communism. They are a leftist communist state.
This is the future. Populism is the future. People that are, populism means you're appealing to the people based on their culture and also their economic interests.
Their perceived economic interests. And that's why populism is a ridiculous term. What you're basically saying is politicians should always do whatever is the most popular. No shit, Sherlock. It's not going to ever be what's best for the people unless the people are educated enough, or at least not indoctrinated into communism, which is what you're explicitly advocating for here.
Using working class, middle class resentment against the elites. Whether you think the elites are benevolent, shadow hand, invisible hand, they're amazing, titans of industry, whatever, they're the people that are destroying the country. So if we can mobilize the people against the elites based on cultural identity and economic resentment, whoever gets populism controls the next century.
Eat the rich. Where have I heard that before? Oh yeah, Antifa. Oh yeah, communists. Fuentes is a shill. I'm willing to state it. He is obviously a shill. He is trying to convince conservatives to adopt a position of only going in on immigration and abandoning any pretense of supporting the free market, because I think that those in power, these elites that he's demonizing here, or at least saying that we should entertain the concept of demonization for a political end, these same elites understand that it's the economic argument that has the most merit and that can win, and the entire argument behind manipulating demographics is based on the economic reality and the economic impact. What they're doing is they're using Fuentes, this shill, Nick Fuentes, in order to promote a narrative that will get the right to abandon the one thing, the one rhetorical point, and it is rhetorical at this point, but they're getting them to abandon the free market stance because that's the only stance with merit, so that all they have to do is just hammer home the idea that conservatives are a bunch of racists and that's all they stand for. And what Nick is going to do here is set up a paradigm where you have two versions of communist, socialist, leftism, both of which will guarantee the exact same outcome, except his is going to be the racist one, and everybody's going to be too goddamn retarded because they were educated by a bunch of communists in the fucking public education sector that he doesn't have the goddamn chest hair to oppose. And they're just going to choose the left. It's just going to guarantee leftist victory. The idea that this is somehow politically viable, what, based on Britain? Based on the UK? Based on that failed state? That failed communist fucking hellhole?
The left can't do it. The left can't make this leap. They can't go from left-wing on culture identity to right-wing on culture and identity. Or if they can, it's very difficult. You know, I think the person who's most posed, or rather the most poised to do that, will be somebody like Bernie Sanders. And he's nowhere even close. He's not even close to being right-wing on any of these cultural issues. So the quote is, it's much easier for right-wing people to go left on economics than it is for them to go here. So let's go there. Boris Johnson went there. Boris Johnson, who is right because he supported the Brexit, because he's right-wing on culture and identity, and at the very least, he was ambivalent about economics. Maybe you could say he's fluid between these two. He was able to capture this area, this quadrant that unleashed a lot of votes, a lot of potential, and that's going to be the realignment. This is, in some sense, in a little way, what Trump did. You know, I put Trump up here based on how he governed, but how he campaigned, he'd probably be closer to here. Because on healthcare, he didn't say, we need a free market healthcare system. He said, we need to take care of everybody. You know, on government spending, he didn't even talk about the deficit. He said, like, oh, I'll bring down the deficit, but he also said, I want $1 trillion infrastructure project, right?
The way he campaigned actually did suggest more of an economic right-wing stance than how he governed. How he governed is actually much more economically left-wing than what he campaigned on, despite these points Fuentes bringing up being accurate. Despite that, he still campaigned on a more right-wing stance than what he actually governed on. And you can just look at the difference in the deficit between Trump versus Obama to see that this is the case.
Right? He said, we want tariffs. We're going to tell companies that if you outsource your labor or whatever, we're going to put a tax on you and tax your product and make it harder for you to do business. That's trending left wing. So Trump, I think, definitely campaigned here. We just need to realign the whole party this way. We need to get the rhetoric, the policy, consolidate some of the ideas, and have a very coherent sort of nationalist, populist perspective on the world. A very nationalist, populist ideology. That, to me, is the future. Somebody like a Tucker Carlson, and maybe could even take it a little bit further. But that's, to me, the whiteboard. That's the big takeaway from the British elections. That's really kind of why I wanted to talk about it, because we see that it works. Boris Johnson, in many ways, proved that it worked. When he went over this, this city, Blythe Valley in northeast England. It's a mining district. It's working class white people that have been voting Labour forever. And he made them Tory, and they voted overwhelmingly for the right-wing party. That's realignment. It's realigning people that might have been, what would you say? It's people that were over here. They're now voting right-wing instead of left-wing. So to me, that's the big takeaway from the election. But
this is the only evidence he offers that what he's suggesting here is in any way politically viable. And frankly, even if it were politically viable, if we're already going to embrace socialism, there's no fucking point. It's not going to make a goddamn difference. He just wants to live in a shithole that's all white people suffering, right? We're going to deport all the brown people so that I guess they get to avoid the communist hellhole he's going to turn America into if he has his way. Or we entertain the idea that maybe in the UK, which is a failed state where everyone is a communist, maybe, just maybe, those people are a little bit different from Americans.
that's our whiteboard. We're going to move on and take a look at our super chats.
Yeah, go count your shekels, because Nick Fuentes is a shill. Stop giving him money. If you give him money, you're just giving money to the globalists. It's like really obvious at this point. And that's all I have to say about this. This video is a lot longer than I guess it needed to be, but goddamn. Now, to be clear, when it comes to TPUSA versus Nick Fuentes and the Groypers, I support Nick Fuentes and the Groypers. I'm all for them coming in there and fucking their shit up when it comes to conservative ink, because they need to have that awakening. But don't be deluded. I think that what he's advocating for here is completely stupid. It's not viable. It's not practical. It's an open betrayal of any sort of ideal. And frankly, it's unchristian. And I think that Nick Fuentes' YouTube channel might be the single most satanic and anti-Christian YouTube channel on all of YouTube. I think there are Satanist channels that are less Satanist than what Nick Fuentes is engaging in here. Because if he actually believed any of that shit, he wouldn't be focusing on politics so much. That's really not the Christian way. Why do you think all your saints are martyrs? That's the last thing he'd want to do. I feel like he'd betray or sell out anyone if it meant, him not dying. That's just the read of it that I get, and I really think that what he's stated here and advocated here, it justifies my claim that Christians tend to be a bunch of backstabbers. Not all of them, of course. This is true for any generalization. But it seems to be the case over and over again that it's the libertarians who offer the solution that would be the most Christian solution. And Christians, they don't like that. They don't like that because they never want to lose. And also, they never want to withhold any opportunity to make a deal with the devil. It seems like the libertarians have real principles and real convictions and real ethics that they stand to. And Christians don't seem to have the conviction of their beliefs to be able to enforce their morals through voluntary means and through building communities and through things like that. No, they rely upon a very satanic, anti-human terrorist monopoly to maintain that. And it tells you everything you need to know. They're a bunch of Pascal's wager Christians, because the entry of a religious person into politics implies a reverse Pascal's wager, which is just a reverse method of proving that they're disingenuous in that belief. And it represents just a lack of conviction and a lack of having a strong moral or ethical foundation, which I think Nick Fuentes has become the epitome of. He's essentially a socialist. He should have been, like a news entertainment, like an infotainment personality, or like a comedian maybe, as like a figurehead for a movement with any seriousness in terms of either ethics or morality. It's an absolute failure. The only utility that he has in that dimension is as controlled opposition, and I think that's what's happening here.